It's called Reputation, Risk, and Resilience. And within it, you're summarizing and analyzing 8 different global communication strategy reputation reports from the last year on the current and emerging state of trust, risk, resilience, employee engagement, security, and business continuity. So you're like the concierge to all the data that's in here. The reports include like the Gallup State of the Global Workplace, the Edelman Trust Barometer, and Ipsos Reputation Council report. Now, as you went through these, and of course, you're looking for the common threads, the common themes, what stood out to you?
Absolutely. And I've been called many things before. Concierge is not one of them, so I'll take it. It's today is a first, many of them worse than that. So yes, so in a way there were 2 sets of red threads of common denominators that I pulled out. The first is what I called, unsurprisingly, the 10 key themes. And I won't obviously go through every single one, but they were things like, the looming shadow of geopolitics, as I called it. There's the interplay of mis and disinformation and polarization. And I called that the terrible twins, because I think we're increasingly seeing polarization fueling mis and disinformation, and mis and disinformation compounding polarization. Cyber security, or rather cyber insecurity, climate catastrophe, real concerns about the trajectory of the global and local economy. One that perhaps surprised me was the idea that we've kind of pretended that the COVID-19 pandemic never happened, but it was the number one business disruptor in the last 12 months in the form of stress, anxiety, depression and absenteeism. So what I call the long human tail of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's just a flavour of some of the main themes. And then what I did at the back end of the report, having summarised each of the 8 constituent reports, is I pulled out 10 key challenges to address. So if you like, the 10 challenges and opportunities that result from the key themes and the analysis.
There's a lot to unpack there. Something that really stood out to me as I read your report is you talk about, in terms of reputation and crisis, but I suppose communications on the whole, is that technology is replacing so many things, and perhaps rightfully our attention is becoming more and more devoted to those technologies, including generative AI, but that there's a very human element here. And maybe we're missing some pieces that are extremely impactful related to that human element. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, the human imperative, as I call it, has been a sort of mild obsession of mine for about the last decade, not as some highfalutin intellectual idea, but as something really practical. Because if you think about it, you can define a crisis as an event of such a magnitude that it has the potential to fundamentally disrupt business as usual and reputations, and that's all great. But I have a sort of alternative definition of crises, which are that they're essentially human events that have very real human consequences that therefore require a human response based on human empathy. And I think if you think about crises essentially as human at their core, if we respond to those challenges and opportunities with technical systems and technological processes alone, we're kind of bound to fail. And that's why I talk a lot in my work and about my business as saying that essentially organizational resilience ultimately depends on human preparedness. In other words, the resilience of our human systems. But I think we still spend too little time on the sort of human training and the human stress testing on which that organizational resilience depends.
Do you ever get any pushback on that? Do you ever get CEOs saying, that sounds great, a little hallmarky, but we have these technologies and people are just going to be happy with the outcome, so don't worry about it? Do you get pushback on that concept?
Do I get pushback? I think I see a sort of organizational tendency because risk and resilience are very often led from outside the comms function. They're very often led by the risk function or strategy or operations, who tend, and this is not a criticism, they tend to take an approach that basically looks at risk through the lens of risk registers and risk appetite statements and heat maps. And that's all lovely, but they forget to then go, how does that look in the real world? What is the real world human manifestation of that piece of paper? So I think a lot of the time it's reminding people that it's not about paper risks, it's about real world risk scenarios, and that if you get the pushback, if you like, how I push back on that pushback.
You used the term polycrisis in your report, and I assume that's because, late at night I'm watching the news about the war in Ukraine or the Middle East. I know disinformation is constantly surrounding me with technology to ramp it up, cybersecurity, climate change, all that stuff. Go into what you mean by polycrisis, and I'm wondering if this is what's accelerating the social divide that's causing the polarization that's having impact on all of us.
Yeah, I mean, there are two related terms that I use in the report. One is permacrisis, which is actually a relatively recent term. I mean, it's kind of interesting that in the UK, at least, Collins Dictionary made permacrisis their word of the year in 2022. So that gives you a feel of the extent to which it's sort of permeated public consciousness and day-to-day language. Polycrisis is slightly different and much older. So without getting too bookish, it was actually coined by a couple of French social scientists in the 70s. And it's basically about the idea that we have the sort of simultaneous interplay, the mutually reinforcing interplay of multiple risks, threats, and catastrophic events. And again, as an example, Ipsos in their trends report last year, the title of that was A New World Disorder, Navigating a Polycrisis. So I think what we've seen in the last decade is that the idea that both have become embedded in our everyday lives with very real implications, for government, corporations, communities, individuals, and actually I think, as you say, society at large. So it's that sense of simultaneous permacrisis and polycrisis as one of the defining dynamics of our age.
And we just become numb to it. A couple of weeks ago, I came back from Washington, D.C. on a trip, thought I had a cold, took a test, I had COVID.
Yeah.
Okay. Stayed indoors but COVID is pretty serious. I wasn't, coughing up blood or anything, but I took it all in stride. That's kind of the problem. If we're surrounded by crisis all the time, we take it in stride, we become numb to the causes and the outcomes of all these things and the things that we can fix.
I agree. But, and this is a really important facet of the report, it is not all doom and gloom. There is, dare I say, an optimism that you're right, that we become numb, but as human animals, we also adapt. I mean, anyone who has been through a difficult period of their lives, whether, through their physical health or their mental health, most people I speak to, and it's my own experience, that it's those difficult periods, forgive the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So I do think there is a numbing sense of permacrisis and polycrisis, but I think we adapt and grow stronger through it. And we may come on to it, but I think the idea that crisis is as much about opportunity as risk is really, really important.
All right, make me feel good. Does this lead to, I also love this term, the architecture of critical human infrastructure. If we understand what that is that what eventually leads us to the positives here?
Well, it's partly that. And I mean, just to explain the term, that was an article I wrote recently because I'd been talking to somebody about risk and threats to critical national infrastructure. And I said, well, half the problem, warming to my theme of today, is because we focus on infrastructure as a functional, operational thing, and we forget, and I literally coined the term in the middle of the conversation, we forget our critical human infrastructure. And that is one of the absolute red thread themes running through the whole report, is about the balance of technological, and human systems, and putting human preparedness absolutely at the heart
balance
of how you view resilience. And you're absolutely right, it is not an either or. I think that there seems to be a tendency to assume that if you're saying it's all about human preparedness, you are downplaying or criticizing the idea of technical systems. Absolutely not. It's about a sort of yin and yang dovetail of those two different types of systems.
Okay, then let's get to the positives. You're right. I did feel a sense of doom and gloom from the report, but part of that's confirmation bias. I expected to feel that way. What role could I possibly have as a public relations professional tasked with supporting my company that can lead to the positives?
Oh, where do I start? There are so many opportunities here. And I should have said that one of the other cornerstones of this report and my work more broadly is based on the idea that we fundamentally misunderstand and misuse the word crisis. I'm going to go a bit bookish on you for a second. But if I say crisis, you tend to say, we imagine Edvard Munch's The Scream. It's an idea of disaster or catastrophe. Usually it's an end point. If you actually, as I did 30 years ago when I was doing my master's thesis, looked up where the word crisis comes from, it comes from a Greek word meaning choice, decision, or judgment. And the first time it was ever used in the English language, it was to mean the point in a disease which determines whether the patient recovers or whether the patient deteriorates and passes away. So this idea that properly defined, a crisis is only ever a turning point. It's a point of inflection, potentially as rich in opportunity as risk. And I think if we go into the process of crisis management or crisis comms, expecting us to be managing the downside, then we'll manage the downside. If we go in going, there is opportunity in this crisis, then our entire mindset changes. And there's actually some really interesting research from about 15, 20 years ago from a company called Oxford Metrica, who looked at the share price impact of 200, what they called mass fatality events. And they found that, unsurprisingly, companies that had performed badly in the crisis saw their share price drop on average 15% in a 6-month period. But there was a group of companies who were judged to have done well and saw their share price tick up 5%, 5 percentage points. So I just think
after the initial down, after the initial hit. Yeah.
Yes, or indeed without having a hit in the first place. So I think this idea that we need to, and I often talk about this, we need to reimagine risk and rethink crisis to realize that there's opportunity there. And there's, this sounds deeply immodest, but I'm going to quote myself from the report, which is, that one of the key statements in the report, which weirdly everybody seems to have picked up. I'm just going to pause and scroll through, and then you can edit that in because I can't find the quote. Give me a second. Yes. So, that quote is that despite the interconnected, mutually reinforcing nature of this growing list of top-tier risks which underpin the polycrisis, there's a real opportunity lurking beneath the sense of permacrisis. And the opportunity is the chance to use risk management, to use crisis preparedness and resilience building as sources of huge positive value rather than viewing them as annoying and costly insurance policies. So as I say, there is an optimism born not just of me wanting the world to be better than it is, but on the basis that crises are turning points, not automatic disasters.
The opportunity that exists within a crisis depends on how I am seen to have responded to that crisis. In other words, I could do a good job, but it's seen as a bad job. Or I could do a bad job, but it's seen as I did a good job. How do I influence how people see my response to the crisis? That's a tough question. I get that.
Of course. I hope I can answer it because it's my day job. How you are perceived coming out of a crisis depends on how you communicate, but fundamentally how you behave. And I think there's this absolute fundamental truism of good crisis management and crisis comms, that it's not just about what you say and how you say it, but it's your behavior, what you do and how you do it. Hence the maxim, it's much harder to communicate your way out of a crisis that you've behaved yourself into. So of course there's the behavior and communication during the crisis, but that ignores two other fundamental things. The first is my other obsession, which is preparedness. And I always say when I'm training people, preparedness is 80% of the task. And the problem we face is that because people tend to view the preparedness piece a bit like buying insurance, and none of us like buying insurance because we're paying for something that might never happen, organizations underinvest in the preparedness phase, particularly the human training and stress testing, and then go, oh, we'll deal with it if and when it happens, and probably end up spending 2 or 3 times as much as they would have done if they prepared in the first place. So there's your response during, there's your preparedness for, but crucially, there's also the recovery phase, and having a structured recovery phase built into your plans. Because even if you've prepared and even if you've communicated and behaved well, you still need to think about brand and organizational recovery. So I think it's those 3 fundamental phases that determines the trajectory of how you're viewed.
I love that because I put you on the spot and you had it codified for me really well. Excellent. Thank you. I want to ask you anyway, do you think there's a danger, given that we're becoming more and more polarized within Western society anyway, you're red or you're blue, and the other side is crazy. Do you think there's a danger that AI will evolve, that I may use the blue form of generative AI, or I may choose to use the red form of generative AI and live my world that way?
It's like Neo in the Matrix. Do I take the red pill or the blue pill? I think it's, I don't know whether they realized or whether they consciously made them red and blue. I thought it was fascinating. I think it's like everything. What worries me is that given that the LLMs currently have been trained on the internet, and the internet is both highly polarized and highly biased.
Which is Google influenced, by the way, whatever you think Google's influence is.
Yes, absolutely. So I just worry that, in the same way as we have found ways as a species of using social media to divide ourselves, I'm sure it's perfectly possible that we can weaponize AI to divide ourselves even further. I don't have specific evidence for that. It's just an instinct.
If we can build it, there's something we can fight about. Yeah, but we'll take the positives from your report. Yeah,
correct. Absolutely agree. Yes. Can I add one little bit that I wanted to get in just for the edit potentially, which actually is where the whole hidden superpower thing came from? Because one of your questions, your question about, what role could I possibly play as a PR professional? Can I chuck in a little bit of content there that you can use, lose, or abuse? So, to your question about, what possibly can the PR professional do? One of the things I say in the report that I found deeply inspirational when I first came across it is that there's a professor at MIT called Deborah Ancona who's kind of unearthed a thing from academia in the 70s, which she calls sense making. And that is the idea of being able to make sense of a world of confusion and complexity. And I think and say in the report that our, if you like, our hidden, untapped superpower as professional communicators is being sense makers in chief, if you like, in ways that I genuinely don't believe any other business function is wired to do. And, I talk about the fact that we, of course, should focus on business as usual and business continuity, but we also need to think about reputational continuity and reputation as usual, and focus on relationships as much as we do on reputation. And I think so much of our sense-making power as a function is to help businesses to focus as much on relationships as on reputation, and make sure that we're looking not just at BAU but at reputation as usual.
The truth is, we need courage to do that. And,
yes.
And some will have that courage. Some will think they have that courage, but they don't. And some just don't even want to have the courage to do it.
We need courage, but the reason why I added business continuity and security and employee engagement this year is that if we as professional communicators keep swimming in our swim lane and talking to the C-suite about reputation and relationships, so we should, but we have to be conversant with security and BC and employee engagement. We've got to get more business literate, and that broadening of my scope was one way of broadening my little contribution to these important debates.
Listen up and then speak up.
I like it.
Thank you, Rod. Really do appreciate this today a lot.
Great. I've genuinely enjoyed it, and I hope I sort of got to answer to your questions.
If you'd like to send a message to my guest, Rod Cartwright, we've got his contact information in the show notes. Stories and Strategies, co-production of JGR Communications and Stories and Strategies podcast. Hey, if you're listening on Apple right now, do me a favor, go in, leave a rating for the podcast. That's kind of like gasoline for the podcast. It's like energy juice. Really helps drive more people on Apple. And if you're on Spotify, leave a comment on the episode in the comments section. That's the energy juice within Spotify. Thank you to our producer, Emily Page. And lastly, do us a favor, forward this episode to one friend. Thanks for listening. Okay, listen, let me stop.